With a strong foothold in mainland China, Japan sought to advance its dominance of the Pacific, establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To those ends, in December 1941, the empire launched a globally synchronized attack, striking Hong Kong, Malaya, and Pearl Harbor. But as World War II dragged on, it would become clear that Japan had woken the American sleeping giant, and the empire's extensive reach into the Pacific had weakened its grasp. A new year was beginning, and a Japanese soldier wrote in his diary, "I greet 1942, a year of great significance, with a body and mind as clear and clean as an azure sky. In this year, more than any other, we must fulfill the path of the warrior."
Japan's military objectives in the opening days of this war, she begins, is to seize the great British fortress of Singapore.
The last British forces, battered by their fighting, retreated down the Malay Peninsula and crossed the causeway linking to Singapore on January 31st. By the time the Japanese pursuit reached Singapore Island, they were outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, had been marching for over 50 days, and were short of ammunition. Every soldier carried a manual that told him, "When you encounter the enemy after landing, think of yourself as an avenger. Here is the man whose death will lighten your heart."
The Japanese plan, of course, is we will dominate the airs and the seas around Singapore, and we will drive south with an army under General Yamashita to seize Singapore. We don't need infrastructure. Our soldiers will use mountain bikes to outflank the enemy, and we'll have support from airplanes and from ships at sea.
On the 1st of February 1942, the equivalent of 4 British divisions stood in Singapore. They had blown the causeway to the mainland, but the Japanese had boats. 7 days later, the Japanese landed on the island of Pulau Ubin, but the attack was a feint. The main invasion came when 3 Japanese divisions crossed the Johor Strait. Their beachheads well established by the 9th, they advanced towards Singapore City. Winston Churchill cabled General Wavell, the commander in the Far East. No question of surrender must be entertained until after protracted fighting in the ruins of Singapore City. The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs. The whole reputation of our country and our race is at stake. As the Japanese faced greater numbers, General Yamashita ordered his artillery to fire as though their supply of ammunition was inexhaustible. Japanese bombers pummeled the city as their engineers patched the causeway. Yamashita brought his tanks across by the 14th, the day that the Japanese advance reached the Alexandra Hospital. A British officer advancing under a white flag was bayoneted. Patients and staff, numbering about 250, were captured, and most of them were killed over the next 24 hours.
シンガポールはイギリスのアジアにおける拠点ですから、シンガポールを叩けばイギリスは アジアから、遠くの方へに、引き下がるしかないと。だからイギリスを叩くためどうしてもシンガポールを落とさなければならなかったわけですね。で日本の方には一体シンガポールにどのくらいのイギリス軍がいるか。で後になってですねあれほど大軍がシンガポールにいるとはということで日本が随分びっくり仰天してるんですけども、もし正確な数が分かっていたら、多分作戦も変えたしもしかしたらシンガポール作戦をやらなかったんじゃないかなと思うんですが。
On the 15th of February, General Arthur Percival, commanding Singapore, wrote in his diary, "There is no hope or help on the horizon." He surrendered his command of about 80,000 troops, the greatest defeat in the history of British arms. Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun reported the fall of Singapore, claiming, "Japan is the sun that shines for world peace." But in every occupied territory, the killing of civilians seemed to contradict that boast. In Singapore, Operation Sukching, purge through cleansing, targeted Chinese males aged 18 to 50. Japan places the death toll at 5,000. The Singaporean estimate is between 20 and 50,000.
It looked as though Japan was going to have victory after victory. And so there was a lot of excitement. After the fall of Singapore, there was a huge celebration in Tokyo. Thousands and thousands of people showed up.
With success in Singapore, the Japanese controlled nearly all of Southeast Asia. The Philippines, an American colony since 1898, remained the only Allied stronghold in the region. America's Filipino air fleet was ravaged in Japan's initial strikes. Allied supply depots were located close to invasion points and quickly lost to the attackers. Still reeling from the Pearl Harbor attack, Washington was unable to deliver adequate supplies or reinforcements. For 3 months, the US and Filipino forces held Bataan against the Japanese. When General Wainwright surrendered on May 6, 1942, Japan's war of conquest was effectively over. 1/6 of the Earth's surface had been occupied in less than 6 months. Japan had seized more than 2.5 million square kilometers of land in Southeast Asia, and practically the entire western half of the Pacific Ocean. More than 150 million people had been added to Emperor Hirohito's subjects. More than 500,000 European and American civilians and close to 150,000 military prisoners were in Japanese hands.
戦うための集団化してましたから、非常に勢いのいい、なんて言いましょうかね、もう非常にとにかくファイトを持っている集団として、行動してましたから。
Japan had not lost a single battleship, aircraft carrier, heavy or light cruiser, while it had gained food and resources of great importance. Conquest had netted Japan 70% of the world's tin supply, most of its natural rubber, and the oil production of the Dutch East Indies. However, had the assault on oil-rich targets failed, Japan's war would have been over. Instead, captured wells were supplying Japan with almost as much fuel, denied her by the American embargo. When Emperor Hirohito heard the news of the Dutch formally surrendering their possessions, he said, "The fruits of war are tumbling into our mouth almost too quickly." He was right. The scale and speed of the Japanese offensive posed problems which Japan would never solve.
Japan has in hand this enormously expanded colonial territory. How are you going to manage it? How are you going to administer it? And the plans are very kind of ad hoc.
No colonial civil service had been created, and those installed proved incapable of understanding variations in language and culture. A violent chapter of occupation was about to be written. Overseeing their new empire, the Japanese resorted to stern tactics, which quickly alienated the local populations. Like military and Western internees, natives had to bow to the Japanese and were slapped in the face if they failed to do so. Boards were erected in towns and villages listing the laws. Colonial rule was replaced by colonial rule, and popular support for the Japanese occupation failed to emerge. Japan's wartime ideology was ripe with contradiction. The empire saw itself as the liberators from Western oppression. However, a deeply ingrained belief in racial superiority empowered the conduct for which the Japanese occupying forces became known. Those beliefs were expressed in media produced for the territories, in song, in cinema, and in cartoon strips.
There's no Ministry of Propaganda. There's no Joseph Goebbels who leads both psychologically in terms of what is good propaganda or in terms of policy. It's kind of a mess and kind of complex, but at the same time, that allows it to take a very amorphous approach.
During the war, Japanese comic art was supported by the state and used for propaganda purposes in leaflets dropped into war zones. It appeared in the magazines that children read and the newspapers their parents consumed.
日本軍が進出していった時に掲げたスローガンというのは大東亜共栄圏およびアジアの解放民族独立というスローガンを掲げていっていったもんですから
This is something different. This is something new. This is going to be racial harmony. This is going to be Asian self-determination. This is going to be Japanese leadership of Asian independent movements. And in keeping with that, the Japanese proceeded to use the Manchukuo model, the model of the client state, the putative independent state, and set up all of these different puppet or client or satellite governments throughout all the occupied areas of Southeast Asia.
The biggest problem with this concept was Japan's words and actions did not match. So it became more brutal and entitled as the situation became more desperate.
One of the great goals of the co-prosperity sphere, according to a Japanese report, was to ensure that Japanese immigrants were in control of agriculture wherever they migrated. The document declared, "We must plant the blood of the Yamato race in this soil," and stressed that Japanese immigrants were to act as mentors and role models in their host country, while forbidding them from intermingling with other races. Hoping to legitimize the sphere, Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo held the Great East Asia Conference in late 1943. The participants were obliged to conduct the proceedings in their only common language, English.
1941年の8月にイギリス・アメリカ側が大西洋憲章っていうのを出すんですね。つまりその戦争目的 連合国側の戦争目的というのを発表します。でこれに対抗して少しでもこのアジアの人々を日本に引きつける、そのためにですね、英米の支配、植民地支配を批判して決して日本はそれとは違うんだっていうことを強調するのがこの大東亜会議の目的だったんです。
Hideki Tojo's attempt to shore up the co-prosperity sphere with his conference was too late. President Roosevelt had announced that unconditional surrender was the only way the war would end. Japanese treatment of native populations was not the only cause for discontent in the occupied territories. Wages were cut. In the East Indies, the day rate fell to 1/2 of what it had been under the Dutch, and inflation soared as Japan liquidated all enemy banks and replaced them with its own.
Japan was not a large economy. The economies of the occupied areas in Southeast Asia had been enmeshed into the global economies of Europe and North America. Japan, especially wartime Japan, was simply not in a position either to buy materials from Southeast Asia or to provide manufactured goods. And that led to an increasingly difficult economic situation, which made all the other hardships, all the brutality of the Japanese occupation, seem all the worse.
In Batavia, now Jakarta, the rice warehouses were full, but the food was reserved for the Japanese. When desperate residents stormed the warehouses, the Japanese beheaded some of the protesters and stuck their heads on poles. In China, and from Singapore to the Philippines, the civilian death toll mounted in the face of violence, hunger, and the breakdown of medical services. The number of deaths caused by the military across the entire war is impossible to fathom, with figures ranging from 3 to 10 million. An executive order declared that Western languages have ceased to exist. Schools were closed, pending the completion of a new curriculum that included the compulsory study of Japanese. The Roman calendar was even replaced. 1942 became 2602, denoting the number of years since the first Japanese emperor had ascended the throne. In the absence of civilian administrators, the fate of the conquered lay in the hands of the military. Their excesses were not reported in the newspapers and are still contested. The headlines of the day preferred to exult in the apparently endless victories.
The War Ministry censored all articles that had to do with military affairs. So there was a high degree of misreporting. And after a while, people caught on that the figures were being tinkered with and the results of battles were being misreported.
Across Japan's occupied territories, neighborhood associations, known as tonorogumi, managed households in an air raid or similar wartime event. There are more than 1 million of them, each comprising between 10 and 12 households. Instructions handed down by the government to the tonorogumi included: rise early, give thanks for what you have, cooperate with the authorities, render public service, be punctual, encourage thrift, and enhance physical and spiritual discipline. Censorship reinforced these instructions. Western music and film were beyond suppression, treated as though they never existed. A call went out for the voluntary surrender of Western records. Despite the involvement of the police, it was not very successful. One Hollywood film passed by the censors. 1939's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington showed James Stewart's heroic campaign against the corruption of American democracy. Tonorigumi slipped easily into a climate of fear and oppression, an ideal seedbed for informers. The network became a force for widespread repression. 22 special police stations were established throughout Japan. When conducting surveillance, the Home Ministry ordered the police to investigate the career, environment, mental and physical conduct, and changes in thought of the person in question. One of the tools for bringing people together was the repertoire of Tonorigumi songs, one of which asked, "Why should we be afraid of air raids? The big sky is protected with iron defenses. For young and old, it is time to stand up. We bear the honor of defending the homeland. Come on, enemy planes, come on many times." Takahashi Aiko wrote in her diary, "Each time there is an air defense drill, we are made to line up in single file, call out our names, and roll call is taken." When the enemy planes did eventually come and bomb wood and paper houses, the Tonorigumi's endless hours of practicing passing buckets of water along a human chain were of little use. On April 18, 1942, 16 specially adapted B-25 bombers prepared to launch from their carrier, Hornet. In the history books, the operation carried the name of its commander, the Doolittle Raid. The bombers departed for Tokyo and 4 other cities.
They weren't expecting this. And one of my diarists writes about hearing the sound of explosions in the sky and looking up and seeing anti-aircraft shells exploding. And she learns that American bombers have bombed Tokyo.
The aircraft didn't have the range to return to the carrier, so they flew on to land in China, where most crashed. Crews that fell into Japanese hands became prisoners of war or were shot.
We all feel pretty strongly about these boys that we were with, and if there's any way to get even, we'll certainly try.
It was a kind of publicity stunt, a way of showing the Japanese that they were not invulnerable, that they could be attacked. Naval strategists and tacticians in Japan recognized that the defense perimeter that had been constructed had been broken.
Bombs had fallen on Tokyo, close to the imperial palace, threatening the life of the emperor. One citizen described the raid's effect. "We started to doubt that we were invincible." The shock and shame cried out for a response from a military caste whose first duty was to defend the emperor. It was evident to Japanese planners that flights from the nearby Chinese mainland were possible. On April 21, 1942, days after the Doolittle Raid, Japan's Chinese Expeditionary Army was ordered to knock out air bases in Zhejiang and Jiangxi. By early July, Japan's forces had met all of their objectives, but China did not stop fighting, detaining 820,000 Japanese troops from operations elsewhere. Chiang Kai-shek felt that the contribution of Chinese forces were not being appreciated, and promises were not being kept. The feeling of inadequate appreciation of China's role in the war would not diminish. 30% of those who died in the Second World War were Chinese. and 39% of Japan's casualties were taken in the fight with China. Japan began planning a counterblow to the Doolittle front, one which would neutralize America's capacity to launch raids on the home islands. But the planning exposed divisions in Japan's military command. Contention between Japan's army and navy could be traced back to clan rivalry in feudal times. Military efficiency was compromised at every step by competition for resources, money, and manufacturing capacity. The rivalry was dramatically illustrated in the aircraft industry. Both services were battling to build the most effective air arm. A 1943 survey found that an industry with the capacity to produce 53,000 aircraft annually was producing less than 10,000. Each service commissioned too many prototypes, striving to outdo the other. It was also calculated that only 55% of the aluminium allocated to manufacturing ended up in aircraft. The rest fell into the black market. The inter-service rivalry reached levels of damage impossible to reconcile with the image of a unified and obedient nation.
The Navy has promised the Army that this will be a short war against the United States, Britain, the Dutch, and so the Army sort of accepts the Navy's assurances at face value. But of course, by the end of 1942, that all does not pan out. And so the Army begins to feel betrayed by the Navy.
The Army, which had little need for oil, controlled the spoils won from the former Dutch colonies. In several crucial actions, they denied the Navy access. Of the two services, Emperor Hirohito said, "If there is friction between them, this war cannot be concluded successfully." Hirohito was right. The divisions within the military were exacerbated by a factional argument within the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
ここに実は戦争始まる前に日本の海軍に2つの考え方がありまして、一つは山本五十六が考えていることで、日本の艦隊がアメリカ艦隊を追いかけてですね、そして全滅させる。そうすれば太平洋を自由に利用できるという、そういうこれが山本五十六の考え方なんですね。でこれに対して東京の海軍の、軍令部という、組織なんですけど、作戦を立てる、機関ですけれども、こちらの方はアメリカが反撃するときには必ずオーストラリアを利用すると。だからそのアメリカに反撃させないためにはオーストラリアを使わせないという。
To disrupt US plans to utilize Australia as a staging ground for offensive action, the Japanese naval staff favored occupation of southern New Guinea. The combined fleet staff, led by Yamamoto, argued for a full-scale engagement with the American Pacific Fleet. In a fatal compromise, the Japanese agreed to do both.
So they sent an invasion fleet covered by part of Yamamoto's combined fleet, a carrier division of two big carriers, Zuikaku and Shokaku, to cover the invasion fleet that's going to seize Port Moresby. And that will be a jumping-off point for further Japanese plans to cut the strategic sea lines between the United States and Australia.
On the 4th of May, an invasion force to initiate the naval staff strategy sailed for Port Moresby, the key to New Guinea.
The American code breakers in Hawaii under Joe Rochefort, break the code. And they figure out that there's something up in the Coral Sea. Nimitz decides to take a gamble and send two of his carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, off to the South Pacific to the Coral Sea.
The battle was initiated when U.S. carrier Yorktown launched surprise attacks on Japanese forces in the area. The next day, the main Japanese strike force, built around two heavy carriers, entered the Coral Sea. The American and Japanese fleets engaged without significant results on the 7th, but around 0800 the following morning, the two forces located each other.
The Japanese had people who were carrier admirals who understood how to use the aircraft, and they had up to 6 carriers working together in coordinated groups. But many in the Japanese Navy still believed in this doctrine that the carriers were just the auxiliaries that came first, and then you followed them up with the heavy ships, whether they were battleships or heavy cruisers. That never happened, and Coral Sea proved it.
For the first time in history, those serving aboard opposing ships in a naval action never sighted each other. The Lexington was hit and abandoned. Shokaku disabled and forced to retire. And Zuikaku, though undamaged, lost 40% of her air group. The Americans were obliged to withdraw, allowing the Japanese to claim victory. But it was a victory that compelled Japan to abandon plans for an invasion of New Guinea from the sea.
The Japanese Navy doesn't regard the Coral Sea as a defeat. They sort of see it as sort of a half-baked victory, and so they refuse to see it as a defeat. But Yamamoto makes the argument that the American Navy needs to be finished off once and for all.
Yamamoto's moment had arrived. The action of the combined fleet would finally neutralize American naval strength in the Pacific and deal with a small Hawaiian outlier that had provided cover for the carriers from which the Doolittle Raiders flew. A place 4,000 kilometers from the nearest continent in any direction. A place called Midway.
アメリカの機動部隊を空母をおびき寄せるためにミッドウェーに日本が進出し、ミッドウェーのアメリカの基地を攻撃すればアメリカの機動部隊、空母部隊もそこに必ず来るはずだと。そうすれば日本側は、日本の空母は全部健在だし戦艦もあるわけですから 100% 揃ってるわけですね。一方アメリカの空母っていうのは3隻ぐらいしかないわけでして、絶対に勝つはずだ。すなわちおごりですね。
Midway would not be decided by fleets of warships. It was the almost 500 aircraft that the opposing navies wielded like long-range cannon that settled the issue. The battle opened on June 4th, when aircraft from Admiral Nagumo's 1st Striking Force attacked aircraft and installations on Midway itself. When the aircraft returned, the Admiral decided to re-equip them with bombs for a second attack on the island. At 10:20, he gave the order to launch when ready. But before Nagumo's bombers took to the sky, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of the USS Enterprise led his dive bombers in the charge. The carrier Kaga was hit first, then Akagi, then Soryu, when USS Yorktown's bombers joined the assault. Japan lost 4 carriers, more than 3,000 seamen, and 250 aircraft.
ミッドウェー海戦が行われまして6月ですね。でミッドウェー海戦でもって日本海軍が思いもよらずに日本海軍の空母最新空母ですね要の中心になっている空母が全滅したっていうことが出てきまして、そのあたりから日本の戦略っていうのが狂ってしまったんですね。すなわちシーレーンが実は確保されないというなどから日本の輸送船が攻撃されてしまった。それがだんだんと東南アジアの石油が日本に供給されない原因になってますね。で徐々に日本の、その国力っていうものが消耗してくるという状況になって敗戦につながったわけです。
The news of Midway was passed to Prime Minister Tojo in typically obtuse language. As General Moritaki Tanabe announced, the Navy has made a great mistake.
And that was sort of a turning point. People began to sense that things weren't going well.
Japan's losses equalized the strength of the opposing fleets. But between 1942 and 1944, Japan would add 6 new fleet carriers, the USA 14.
By 1943, it was clear that the mass production of warships by the Americans was an advantage. They had a production line of them.
In fact, throughout the war, for every major naval vessel built in Japanese shipyards, the Americans built 16. Japan was soon struggling to bring home the war material plundered throughout the Pacific. With little strategy or resources to safeguard transport ships, they were sunk in unsustainable numbers.
ほとんどアメリカの潜水艦および駆逐艦などによってあるいは飛行機によって、沈没させられてます。だから日本にほとんど油田はあるんですよ。ラインって言ってインドネシアの油田はあるんです。スマトラとかねジャワの油田はあるんですけれども、そこから油が一つも入ってこないっていう状況になったんですよ。
In 1942, 40% of the oil from captured fields reached Japan. Within 2 years, the figure had fallen to just 5%. The Pacific Ocean covers an area greater than all of the land masses combined. Its scale dwarfs the scattered patches of dry land that rise from its waters. But the existence of these islands made extending the Japanese Empire into the Pacific feasible. A ring of fortified islands would make the empire defensible. But garrisoning and supplying those islands would be, according to the Imperial Vice Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Tsukada Osamu, like sowing salt in the sea.
The Japanese are always overreaching, and each time they take one base, they think, well, we need to push our defensive perimeter even further out so that we can try and make sure that we're defending that as well. And that's essentially what's happened. First, they've taken Truk, they've set up a base there. They've thought we need to defend Truk, so they've pushed out the defensive perimeter further and taken Rabaul. Once they've got Rabaul, they think, well, now we need to protect Rabaul.
The Empire had inadequate ships and aircraft to compete in a war based on mobility. Japan, where since 1938 the military had consumed 75% of government expenditure, was simply outmatched by American industry. Each American frontline soldier was supported in the Pacific by 4 tons of supplies, each Japanese combatant by a single kilogram.
As opposed to the Americans, who had a 16 or 17 to 1 ratio for everybody in their supply line and the single combatant on the island, the Japanese ratio was roughly 1 to 1.
60% of Japanese soldiers who are recorded as having died in combat, in actual fact, probably died of starvation.
In every modern nation with a military, the state has to commemorate its fallen soldiers. It becomes a very important part of the propaganda of modern nation states, and it was very important in Japan as well. Fallen soldiers were commemorated at the Yasukuni Shrine, which before the war was a public institution.
When a loved one died or was killed on active service, the remains seldom reached home. Hiroshi Fujino was head of a Tokyo Tonorigumi. One of his duties was to read a statement to his group. Families of those soldiers going to active fronts are advised to save locks of hair or pieces of fingernails to guard against not having anything at all of the person of the honored dead.
Soldiers were told that when they died on the battlefield, their souls would return to Japan and that they would be enshrined in this particular temple.
Instead of their loved ones' remains, relatives were visited by a messenger who would recite, "Please accept this notice, comforted by the knowledge that your son died for His Imperial Majesty the Emperor. We express our deepest condolences to the soul of a hero."
For families of fallen soldiers, the sacrifice that they had made was widely recognized. They were embraced by their neighbors, they were given pensions, and they were held up as the very kind of Japanese that were supporting and defending the nation.
With virtually all able-bodied young men in the armed services, women assumed jobs in steel mills, coal mines, and munition factories. Company president Chikue Nakajima complained, skilled mechanics were drafted and replaced by school children. The result was that one of his planes, the Ki-84, earned the nickname the pilot killer.
So there is an industrialization of the younger female labor force, and of course moving them from school into the factories where they're making bombs and whatnot.
Retired army officers showed civilians how to combat invaders. Several thousand Buddhist monks were conscripted, divested of their robes, and sent to munitions plants. Every inch of arable land was used to grow food. All disposable metal was slated to be melted down for weapons. Even the gates of sacred shrines were dismantled and shipped to munitions factories. Sacrifices and shortages were changing perceptions of the war. However, nothing could be allowed to close the public bathhouses. As firewood grew scarce, people were encouraged to donate their old clogs to keep the boilers going. The police had the power to replace any bathhouse manager who failed to keep the water hot. The most innocent of pleasures were reshaped to meet the needs of war. Recreational fishermen were required to turn their catch over to Army or Navy food centers. Everyone was expected to participate in paramilitary drills, as well as air raid exercises. People were told when to exercise and how to pray. The government openly proclaimed its goal, which was the creation of flawless public order. However, the citizens of Japan did not blindly conform to the commands of the state. There was no organized resistance or meaningful protest, but there was disobedience. There was fraud and cheating. People queuing for rations claimed them for the dead and non-existent, an army of aunts, uncles, and grandparents that swelled to a ghost population estimated at 1 million. There was a flourishing illegal black market. the inevitable effect wherever rationing was introduced. When Kenzo Nakajima returned home on leave, he was shocked. Prices were higher, he recalled, and the black market was outrageous. A survey showed that at least half of all families were supplementing their rations from the black market. By 1942, families of 5 spent an average of 4.5 hours a day standing in line for food, sometimes receiving nothing. Oshima Shisu, who lived in Kanazawa, wrote that she heard they were selling sweet potatoes, and we lined up from very early in the morning, but in the end, couldn't get any.
So people gradually are getting less and less fish protein. The same thing happens with the vegetable ration, that it shrinks to the point where Japanese are getting virtually nothing. And food distribution is handled by the neighborhood associations. And of course, many people, especially in the cities, can't survive on what they're getting in the way of food rations.
Tokyo journalist Kiyosora Kiyoshi observed, "Everywhere there is a shortage of rice." He later noted that there is only rice for 2 meals a day, and a third meal is unthinkable.
Another alternative was to buy directly from farmers. And this was a practice called kaidashi. And they weren't supposed to do that either. But on any given day in the city of Tokyo in 1944, between 8,000 to 20,000 people left the city to buy directly from farmers. And 40% of those who trekked to the countryside to buy from farmers were women, and 60% were children, because it was believed that the authorities, if they caught children, would be more tolerant and let them go.
The Japanese public knew from every detail of daily life that the war was not running in Japan's favor, although the tightly censored and manipulated media shielded the population from news. That changed in 1943, when defeat in the Aleutian Islands was reported.
And for the first time, the government used a word that it hadn't used before, the word gyokusai in Japanese, which means the shattering of the jewel. And gyokusai is a pair of Chinese characters that comes from a 7th century Chinese history called the Book of Northern Qi. And the word gyokusai appears in a sentence that reads, "I would rather be a shattered jewel than a perfect gem." In other words, I'd rather die and shatter than survive the war. And so the government began to use the term gyokusai to refer to the collective deaths of many Japanese servicemen.
In March 1943, in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, American aircraft had surprised a convoy transporting an entire division to reinforce Leh and Salamua. All 8 transports were sent to the bottom, along with 4 of the accompanying destroyers. In September, the Allies executed amphibious landings at Leh, and the Japanese evacuated Salamua. There was no more news of brilliant victories. There were greater sacrifices to come. And soon, the bombs would fall. Japan was losing the war.